Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, all really designed so that when you find yourself at that barbecue or that family reunion or that PTO meeting where somebody is just going on and on about confiscating this or do we really need that, you have some data points that you can have a conversation without it being mean. Nobody is expecting you to be mean-spirited about it. We all want to be good neighbors, but just let them know kindly and gently how wrong they might be. You can find out more about our group at tertiumquids.org. Join in our Tuesday morning group coalition meetings. Some great conversation there one-on-one. And you can get podcasts of this program anytime by going to our YouTube channel. Look up Freedom and Prosperity on YouTube. One of our favorite subjects is Dominion Energy, and joining us to kick off this week's program from the Reason Foundation to talk about Dominion's 100% renewables tariff that's in the works, in the pipeline, as it were. That probably triggered somebody just with that word, is Dr. Adrian Moore, Vice President of their Policy Division at the Reason Foundation. Dr. Moore, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Nothing like starting off with a bad pun.
Yeah. Well, are there good ones? I mean, once I got invited, I don't know if they still hold the O. Henry pun-off in Austin, Texas, but that was always fun. There were some interesting times.
Guaranteed good time, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, and Austin is worth it for the food, but if you can throw bad puns in there, you're doing well also. So talk to us. Let people know first and foremost that there is, since tariff comes up in our conversations a lot anyway, so talk about the plan that Dominion has to tariff for their State Corporation Commission for approval of a 100% renewable energy tariff.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, like all things to do with electricity regulation. It's highly technical, highly legalistic, and incredibly boring in its details, but its outcomes have a big impact on our day-to-day lives. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to renewable energy in Virginia, one thing that is going on now is there's some ability under some circumstances for customers who would like renewable energy to go to some what are kind of generally called independent power producers, but people who are not Dominion, but who produce renewable energy and contract with them to buy renewable energy. And I say limited, probably a lot of your listeners, followed the case where Walmart applied to be able to install its own solar and generate its own power for its facilities in Virginia, and Dominion didn't want them to do that and was able to kind of beat them before the FCC to not allow them to do that, because it would be terrible if they were able to generate their own solar power to run their own facilities. Who knows what damage that would do to others? And of course, Dominion argued that, well, that means if they're not buying electricity from us, then the costs of providing electricity get imposed on other people. So this is the weird world of Dominionomics, where, imagine if you didn't like to buy from the Shell station, you like to buy from the Chevron station, and the Shell station said, but wait a minute, if you don't buy gas from us, that makes, we have to spread the cost of our business then over the other customers, which means they have to pay more. So if you don't buy from us, that raises costs for other consumers. And so that's not fair. You have to spread your gas purchase around to everybody to be fair.
It's
That's
an amazing
the logic here.
Well, and logic being a stretch in and of itself, but it is.
I'm using logic in the sense of thinking, I guess, or argument. Yeah, you're right.
I don't recall. I was much younger at the time when we deregulated the telephone service. If the phone companies went through this same sort of harangue, but considering that they're saying if I understand their argument in abstract, is we have to generate the electricity anyway. So if we don't sell it to as many customers as we can, it costs us more because it's not like we're craft brewing each kilowatt of energy for each customer. We're generating the same amount no matter what, even though then during the summer they'll tell us about peak load periods and going into the grid. But you're not supposed to remember those.
You're right. You're not supposed to remember that it's flexible when they want it to be flexible, and it's completely inflexible when somebody wants to compete with them. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. And now what this tariff does, to really grossly oversimplify it, is basically impose a charge. A tariff is a fancy regulatory word for charges.
Yeah.
What they want to do is impose a big charge on any renewable energy that's created for consumers in Virginia, not by Dominion. So in other words, they say, you know what, there's not really that much competition, but even that little bit bothers us. Mm-hmm. So what we want to do is charge them a bunch of money to pay for our renewable energy programs whenever you go to them instead of us. And so they want to basically monopolize the production of renewable energy in the state.
Well, and is it just because I could see this being one of those precedent-setting things that if I understand correctly, what they want to do is dollar for dollar. So if I pay $20 a kilowatt hour for some solar farm to generate my electricity for me and not buy it from Dominion, they want the same amount of money, ostensibly doubling what I would pay for that kilowatt hour. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, here's how you encourage more renewable energy and the benefits that it might have is double the price of it, right?
Yeah, of course. But we're also
not because that price is actually related to the cost of the service to you. I mean, that's the strange, sort of Dominionomics, where pricing has nothing to do with the cost of providing the good that you are purchasing. Mm-hmm. It has to do with supporting their internal operations and cost structure. I mean, monopolies are strange critters, and they work in strange ways. And they're single-mindedly determined to sort of maximize their monopoly profits and reduce competition, even if it's only a little bit at the margin. They just can't stand to see that happen.
Dr. Adrian Moore is Vice President of Policy at the Reason Foundation. You mentioned how strange animals monopolies are government subsidized and or wholly subsidiarized monopolies, or even stranger. And I rarely feel the same bit of vertigo. I feel I've been privy to some of the filings they make with the State Corporation Commission in their, quote, transparency, and rarely do I see something as laughably intransparent as the transparency Dominion tries to portray itself as providing in its filings with the State Corporation Commission, which are politicians that Dominion in many cases have helped them get reelected, then appoint members of the State Corporation Commission to oversee the Dominion that gives them the money for their reelection campaigns. And it's a wonderful system for
it's a very tangled web.
Yes. But they you mentioned the cost of generating these renewables. This still turns out to be completely disconnected from the marketplace. If I want a solar cell to try to generate electricity for my neighborhood, first and foremost, science seems to tell me that solar array needs to be bigger than my community, so I'm going to need to clear cut a good portion of Virginia just to get the solar array necessary to generate enough kilowatt hours for about a cul-de-sac's worth of houses. But if there is a company out there that's trying to do it, Dominion haven't some of their argument been that they've been forced to do these things. So now by being forced to do ineconomical electricity, wind farms, solar cells, that we need to subsidize that effort just out of goodness to the environment? Is that part? If I can characterize their argument, I'm usually
see how
much
hard
more
it is to
logical.
follow the logic.
Forcing myself, it's like trying to write left-handed if you're right-handed. But
you
isn't
could literally get a brain cramp, just like a muscle cramp trying to follow this stuff. But yeah, you're exactly right. So we've spent a long time subsidizing renewable energy, and the argument in favor of that has been that this will have huge environmental benefits, kind of external benefits that are not captured by the market, so that the subsidy is justified for the non-market benefits of using renewable energy instead of energy that emits pollution or carbon or what have you, and so that was the argument for a long time, was whether people were buying that argument or not. Now, generally, that's done pretty well politically. Virginia, like almost every state, does subsidize has many programs that subsidize renewable energy. But the thing is that the economics of renewable energy have really been changing, and that argument is much less persuasive. Maybe not persuasive is not the right word. Political persuasive-ness does not depend on factual reality.
This is
so
truth.
It's much less economical. If it ever was economically true, it's much less so now, because renewable energy has become much more cost-effective and much more affordable. So that at a time when the market could really start taking off and driving the growth in renewable energy, where people are willing to buy it and willing maybe even to pay a little bit extra, you can't power your whole house with a solar panel on the roof. But like I live in Florida, I could heat my pool with one if my electric utility would let me put one in, but they won't. I'm not allowed to put a solar panel in to heat my pool.
That's the most amazing part of it all.
It's crazy. So at a time when we could, sort of on a bipartisan basis, be moving away from subsidizing renewable energy and distorting the market and letting the market do it, the problem we're running into is we don't really have a market, because what we have is a monopoly.
Right.
And the monopoly wants to do renewable energy in the way that it can make the most money off of, not in the way that consumers want.
Is this, like with many government intrusions in the marketplace, actually, and I'm using this term economically, please don't send letters, retard the progress of, if there really is this new energy source that's out there, similar to the way that 100 years ago gasoline replaced wood and diesel fuel replaced oil in many things, and we started generating electricity in ways that we had never thought possible before, and using it for things we never thought possible before. That was economically driven. We could use gasoline to power these vehicles because it was cheaper, because it was really just one of multiple byproducts of oil refining. But now we're not even going to know if there's that economically feasible alternative energy, because these big utilities have such subsidies cramping the market.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you think about it this way, probably right now in the market, there's a bunch of renewable energy sources that are pretty market competitive, and there's a bunch that are not market competitive. And in a world where you have a lot of subsidies and monopoly decision-making, those don't get sorted out. In a market, right, everything shifts to the ones that are market-ready, and money doesn't go to the ones that are not, except for maybe venture capital or something like that, right?
Sure.
But with all these subsidies in place, a lot of money is being wasted on renewable energy that isn't projects and technologies that aren't going anywhere, instead of being concentrated on the ones that are going somewhere, which is what a market would do. So, we really, even if you think that back in the day, having a monopoly to provide electricity was somehow justified, which I would argue was never economically justified. It was only politically true, never economically true. Now with technological change happening, and it's not just renewable energy, but it's distributed generation, it's microgrids, it's digital technology penetrating the potential for how we do electricity from your house to the power plant and everything in between. Monopolies are the worst structure in the world to adopt and adapt to technological change.
Absolutely.
So we need to move to markets in electricity to be able to keep up. It's like an economist friend of mine calls it the Uberization. The way Uber blew up our urban transportation markets and disrupted everything because it offered something that people wanted more than what was being provided by either the nearly monopoly taxi company or the monopoly transit companies. And the same thing could happen in electricity if we just make the monopolies compete.
What is the fruit of this? Because the unholy alliance seems to be politicians who, out of one face will say that they want renewable energy. Because the fascinating thing is when you read these stories, you start to see Democratic Party members popping up as, people in favor of these tariffs and say, hold on, aren't you the guy that was telling me you wanted green energy? Didn't I see you at a Green New Deal rally? But then they turn around and do this. So what are the political ramifications in Richmond for this? Because if I understand your column correctly, Appalachian Power has already gotten this tariff approved.
Yeah, I think I'm not enough of a Virginia political insider to really answer that question super well, because you could look at it two ways. On the one hand, you could say, well, how often does Dominion not get what it wants? Pretty rarely, right?
Yeah,
I think we can all agree on that.
Yep.
On the other hand, they've kind of stepped in it lately, and there's a lot of anger, even in the legislature, about their sort of abuse of their power, so to speak. Since we're doing bad puns today, and and also, like you say, there is this sort of conflict between, do people believe that the best way to get more renewable energy is to monopolize it, or do people think that it should be more consumer driven? I think if you ask the average person on the street, they think it should be more consumer driven. So there's a tension at work here, and you can tell that Dominion feels it. Reason and you guys and others are all part of a coalition that includes a bunch of renewable energy groups, environmental groups, social justice groups, and conservative groups. Who the one thing we all agree on is that this monopoly is terrible and we need competitive markets. I think the conservative groups are more motivated by the unleashing consumer power to choose and unleashing economic forces to drive down costs. I think, obviously, some of the renewable energy groups, some of the environmental groups, they're more driven by the fact that they think consumers will choose more renewable energy than the government subsidies and the monopolies are producing right now. So it's sort of slightly different reasons with some overlap, and when it comes to everybody sort of likes the idea of consumers having more power and the monopoly having less power.
But it is
across the board.
But it is what Adam Smith advised. That's really Adam Smith's model for a free market is, conservatives and progressives can get all what they want because it's a marketplace, and you can get, better prices, you can get better access, you can get more people, even entering and creating small entrepreneurial businesses if you get rid of these government subsidized monopolies. Last time we talked about this on the program, it was a little bit about Texas, a little bit. At the end of the interview, it came up that Florida was working towards, and you mentioned, Adrian, that you're from Florida, Texas is teetering on backsliding away from a market, even a moderate marketplace when it comes to home electric utility usage. Where is Florida? I was told, as we were being told about how Texas may backslide away from it, that Florida is moving on the avant-garde towards more market-based stuff. Catch us up on what you're doing there.
Yeah. Well, you're right. It's an interesting space right now. One thing you're probably going to hear a lot, because Dominion is really on the defensive about this, and they really want to keep bringing up two things. One, that California tried to restructure, or they always say deregulate, even though it's not deregulate, its electricity market. And it was a disaster. And that Virginia, around the same time, about 20 years ago, also deregulated its market and then had to undo it. And so, it's a proven not to work. And they'll say, Texas is getting ready to backslide. I'm much more optimistic, actually, about Texas. I think that, first of all, Texas opened up its electricity market to competition and dramatically reduced the role of the monopolies at about the same time that California did. And I know your listeners will be astonished that Texas managed to get it pretty much right, and California managed to do the most unbelievably incompetent job you could imagine, where they actually, in order to deregulate, they expanded the bureaucracy.
Of course they did.
And then they were shocked that it didn't work.
Yeah,
who would have thought?
The government bureau on getting rid of government bureaus reads like a Douglas Adams book.
So there's Texas has been a little bit schizo on this, but for the most part has shown that consumers benefit tremendously from choice, that you can confine the monopoly to just running the wires, and that the generation and selling of electricity, including lots of renewable sources, can expand dramatically. They've still got things to work on there. I think everyone agrees, but it's also in many, many ways the most successful electricity market in the nation. And, Virginia was much, much closer when it did its deregulation 20 years ago to California than it was to Texas. They allowed people some choice, but only under highly regulated and structured settings. You had to go through a state agency. I mean, it resembled in no way any other market where you buy any other good. And so, what do you know? It didn't work.
It's amazing.
Government-run markets don't work very well.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought?
Who would have thought?
Well, that wasn't really an experiment.
Adrian Moore is Director, Vice President, Policy Analyst for the Reason Foundation. And I know this weekend is one of my favorite events. I'm not going to be there this year. I don't know if you get to go to Freedom Fest at all out in Lost Wages, the least free city out that's not named Chicago, but it has gambling anyway. But Reason always has a great setup there, always a big part of what the Scouts has put together there. If you don't get to go, I hope lots of folks read your stuff and participate in what Reason does there. And I appreciate your visit this week on the program.
Thank you very much. It's great being on.
Up next, Steve Bucci, policy analyst with the Heritage Foundation, on the mass shootings and how to prevent them. Isn't that what everyone in political office wants to do? We'll get into that next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.